I still remember the exact moment my daughter-in-law decided to erase me from the family. She did it with a smile, a raised glass, and a room full of witnesses. It was Mother's Day, and somehow I became the only mother at that table who didn't belong. We were seated at a long table near the windows of a country club just outside Columbus, the kind with white tablecloths, polished silverware, and waiters who refilled your coffee before you even asked. My son Daniel had made the reservation weeks in advance, or at least that's what he told me when he called and said, "Mom, we're doing something special this year." I believed him. I even woke up early that morning and baked my peach cobbler, the same recipe I'd been making since Daniel was a boy, carrying it carefully in my old glass dish wrapped in a clean kitchen towel. When I arrived, Melissa greeted me with her usual composed smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "Evelyn, you made it," she said, as if there had ever been a question. She took the cobbler from my hands and passed it off to a server without even looking inside. I noticed that. I noticed things more now than I used to. The table was already full. Daniel at the center, Melissa beside him, their two children flipping through kids' menus with crayons scattered everywhere. There were a few of Melissa's friends, a couple I didn't recognize, and her parents, who always seemed to fit seamlessly into every corner of Daniel's life. My place card sat at the far end of the table, right next to the aisle where waiters moved in and out. I paused for just a second before sitting down, smoothing my skirt, telling myself it didn't mean anything. "Mom, you're down there," Daniel said, gesturing vaguely, already halfway through a conversation about golf. I smiled and walked to my seat. I've learned how to do that, how to move through a moment without letting it show on my face. The brunch went on like any other. Eggs Benedict, fresh fruit, endless coffee. People laughed. Glasses clinked. I contributed where I could, asked Lily about her school play, told my grandson his drawing looked just like a real fire truck. Melissa kept the conversation flowing, always polished, always in control. Then, halfway through the meal, she stood up. She tapped her glass lightly with a spoon, and the table quieted almost instantly. "I just want to say something," she began, her voice warm, practiced. "Mother's Day is about celebrating the women who built this family, the ones who shaped who we are today." I felt a small, quiet warmth at those words. I thought for a moment that maybe I had been wrong about the seating, about the tone, about all of it. Then she turned slightly, just enough to look down the length of the table toward me. "And while we appreciate everyone here," she continued, lifting her glass, "I think it's important to be honest about who truly belongs at the heart of this family." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "Evelyn," she said, her smile still perfectly in place, "you've never really been part of it." The words didn't land loudly. They didn't need to. They settled over the table like something cold and final. Someone shifted in their chair. A fork clinked against the plate. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the stem of my water glass against my fingers. I looked at Daniel. He didn't look back. Instead, he reached for his coffee and stirred it slowly, as if he hadn't heard a thing. That told me more than anything Melissa could have said. I nodded once, just a small movement, then reached for my glass and took a sip. "Well," I said, my voice steady enough to surprise even me, "that's a very interesting way to define family." A few people let out quiet, uncertain laughs, unsure where to place themselves. Melissa lowered her glass, her expression unchanged. "I think clarity is important," she replied. I studied her for a moment. Calm, controlled, certain. This wasn't something she had said on impulse. This had been decided long before we sat down at that table. I glanced at the far end where the server had placed my cobbler, untouched, still wrapped in the towel I brought from home. And for the first time that morning, a different thought settled in. This wasn't just about a cruel sentence at brunch. This was about something that had been building quietly, deliberately, for longer than I realized. And suddenly, I had one question I couldn't ignore. How long had my own son been sitting at that table, agreeing with her? I did not leave right away. That was the first thing that surprised me about myself. Instead, I stayed seated for another 10 minutes, maybe longer, long enough for the waiter to come by and ask if anyone wanted dessert. Melissa answered for the table before anyone else could speak. "We are all set. Thank you," she said, her tone smooth, as if nothing unusual had just happened. I watched her as she spoke, the way she placed her napkin neatly beside her plate, the way she leaned slightly toward Daniel, as if they shared something private and settled. When the bill arrived, it was placed directly in front of Daniel, but Melissa reached over and glanced at it first. "Looks right," she said quietly, and he nodded without question. That small exchange caught my attention more than the toast had. It was efficient, practiced, and oddly final. I stood up slowly, reaching for my purse. "I think I'm going to head out," I said, keeping my voice even. Daniel finally looked up. "Already?" he asked, though there was no real surprise in his voice. "It has been a long morning," I replied. Melissa gave a polite smile. "Thank you for coming, Evelyn. It was important that everyone heard what needed to be said." There was again that word everyone, as if I had just been included in something rather than singled out. I nodded once, then turned to leave. As I passed the service station near the aisle, I noticed my cobbler sitting exactly where it had been placed earlier, still covered, still untouched. A young server was stacking plates nearby, and I paused just long enough to lift the towel slightly and check. The dish was full, the peaches still glistening under the sugar crust. "Would you like me to box that up for you?" the server asked kindly. "No," I said after a moment. "I will take it with me." I carried it out to my car myself, setting it carefully on the passenger seat of my Buick the same way I had brought it in. The drive home took about 20 minutes, mostly quiet suburban roads lined with trimmed lawns and American flags still hanging from front porches. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, not the words themselves, but the reactions around them. Or rather, the lack of reaction. When I pulled into my driveway, I did not go inside right away. Instead, I sat there with the engine off, my hands resting on the steering wheel, looking at the cobbler beside me. Then I reached for my phone. I opened my messages and scrolled back through the past few months. Birthdays, school events, family dinners. I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. There were gaps. Entire conversations missing. Threads where Daniel had replied to something I had never seen. I scrolled further. In one message from 3 weeks ago, I had asked, "What time is Lily's recital on Saturday?" Daniel had responded, "We already talked about this in the group chat, Mom." Group chat. I stared at that line longer than I expected to. I did not remember any group chat. I tapped on his contact and scrolled through older messages, looking for any mention of it. Nothing. I leaned back in my seat, a slow realization beginning to take shape. This was not just about a single comment at brunch. There were entire conversations happening without me. Entire decisions made somewhere I had never been invited. My phone buzzed suddenly in my hand. A new message from Daniel. "Mom, I hope you're not upset." Melissa did not mean it the way it sounded. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. My fingers hovered over the screen before I typed back. Then how did she mean it? The response did not come right away. I set the phone down on the passenger seat next to the cobbler and looked out at my quiet street. The late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the pavement. For the first time, I was no longer asking whether I had been pushed out. I was starting to wonder how carefully it had all been arranged. And more importantly, who else had been part of that arrangement all along? Daniel's reply did not come until nearly an hour later. By then, I was already inside the house, standing in my kitchen with the cobbler still sitting unopened on the counter. The sunlight coming through the window hit the glass dish just right, making the sugar crust sparkle in a way that felt almost mocking. My phone buzzed again, and I picked it up. "She just means you're not involved in our day-to-day life like her parents are," he wrote. I read it slowly once, then again, letting each word settle where it needed to. Not involved. Like it was a scheduling issue. Like it was something casual, something that had simply happened over time. I set the phone down and leaned against the counter, my hand resting on the edge of the sink. That explanation might have satisfied me a year ago, maybe even 6 months ago. But now, with everything lining up the way it was, it sounded rehearsed. I walked over to the small desk in the corner of my living room, the one I had used for years to organize bills and school papers back when Daniel still lived at home. The drawers still held the same things, neatly arranged. Checkbooks, envelopes, old receipts. I pulled open the bottom drawer and took out a folder I had not looked at in a while. Inside were copies of checks I had written over the past 5 years. Tuition for Lily's private school. A contribution toward Daniel and Melissa's down payment on their house. Holiday expenses that had quietly grown larger each year. I sat down and spread the papers across the desk, smoothing each one out carefully. The numbers were not small. They never had been. I remembered the day Daniel had come to me about the house. He had stood right where I was sitting now, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Mom, we found a place, but we are a little short on the down payment," he had said. Melissa had stood just behind him, quiet, letting him do the asking. I had not hesitated. "Of course," I told him. "That is what family does." I could still hear his voice from that day, clear as anything. "We could not do this without you." I let out a slow breath and looked back down at the checks. That sentence echoed differently now. I reached for my phone again and typed, "Daniel, do you remember the house?" This time, the response came quicker. "Of course I do." "What?" I did not answer right away. Instead, I stood up and walked into the hallway, where a framed photo hung on the wall. It was taken the day they moved in. Daniel and Melissa standing on the front steps, holding the keys, both of them smiling. I was in that picture too, off to the side, one hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. I had always thought it was a good photo. Balanced. Complete. Now I studied it more closely. Melissa was angled slightly inward toward Daniel, her body turned just enough to create a subtle center that did not include me. It was a small thing, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. But I was looking now. I picked up my phone again. "I'm just trying to understand something," I said when I finally called him. He answered on the second ring. "Mom, you are overthinking this," he said immediately, his tone gentle but firm. "Melissa just values structure. She likes things defined." "Defined," I repeated. "That is an interesting word choice." There was a pause on the line, not long but noticeable. I could hear faint background noise, maybe the television, maybe the kids. "Look," he continued, "her parents are more involved. They live closer. They help out more regularly. It is just different." I walked back into the living room and looked down at the papers still spread across my desk. "Different how?" I asked quietly, because from where I am sitting, it looks like I have been involved exactly where it mattered. He did not answer right away this time. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional. And in that silence, something shifted for me. This was not confusion anymore. This was a version of the story they had agreed on, one that made sense if you ignored certain facts. I ended the call a few minutes later, politely, without raising my voice. Then I sat back down at the desk and began organizing the documents into a neat stack. If Melissa wanted things defined, I thought, then perhaps it was time to define them properly. And as I slid the last check into place, a new question formed in my mind, sharper than the ones before it. If they had rewritten my role in the family, what else had they already decided without telling me? The next morning, I did something I had not done in years. I drove across town without calling ahead. Daniel and Melissa's house sat in a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind with evenly spaced mailboxes and freshly cut grass that always smelled faintly sweet in the sun. I had a spare key. I had never needed to use it unannounced before, but that morning I let myself in. The house was empty. Daniel would be at work, and Melissa usually took the children to school around 8:30. The silence inside felt different than my own home. It was fuller somehow, layered with activity that had already happened and would happen again without me. I set my purse down on the kitchen island and looked around. Everything was in its place. Clean countertops, a bowl of fruit, a calendar pinned neatly to the wall near the refrigerator. That caught my eye. I stepped closer. It was a large monthly planner, the kind with handwritten notes in different colors. Blue ink for school events, red for appointments, black for family plans. I scanned the current month first. Soccer practice, dentist appointments, a weekend trip labeled Lake House, Melissa's parents. I moved to the previous month. Easter brunch, Melissa's parents. Spring break, Melissa's parents. I stood there for a moment, tracing the pattern with my eyes. Then I noticed something else. In the bottom corner of the calendar, written in smaller, tighter handwriting, was a note that did not match the others. Core family dinner, Sunday, 6 p.m. No names. No explanation. Just that phrase. Core family. The same words Lily had shown me on her phone. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, pulling up the message Daniel had sent me weeks ago. We already talked about this in the group chat, Mom. My chest tightened slightly, but not in the same way it had the day before. This time, it felt sharper, more focused. I walked down the hallway toward the home office. The door was slightly open. Inside, Melissa's desk was arranged with the same careful precision as the kitchen. A laptop sat closed in the center, a leather planner beside it, and a small stack of mail off to the side. I hesitated for a second before stepping in. Then I reached for the top envelope. It was already opened. Inside was a printed email confirmation from a bank. I unfolded it slowly. The letterhead was clear. A transfer confirmation. $25,000. The date was 3 years ago. My date. I recognized it immediately. It was the exact amount I had given them for the down payment. But the account name listed as the source was not mine. It was Melissa's. I read the line. Again to be sure. Transfer completed from account holder, Melissa Carter. My fingers tightened slightly on the paper. That was not possible. I had written the check myself. I had watched Daniel deposit it. I set the letter down carefully and opened the next piece of mail in the stack. Another confirmation. Another transfer. Smaller amounts this time, but consistent. Tuition payments. Maintenance fees. All attributed to Melissa's account. I let out a slow breath and stepped back, my eyes moving across the desk. There, tucked partially under the planner, was a thin folder. I pulled it free. Inside were printed emails. Organized. Labeled. I flipped to the first page. It was from Melissa to someone named Karen. We have been handling everything on our own, it read. Daniel prefers to keep things within the core family. I turned the page. Another message. It is easier this way. Less confusion about roles. Roles. I closed the folder and stood there for a long moment, the room suddenly feeling smaller than it had before. This was not just omission. This was documentation. Structured. Repeated. Intentional. I picked up my phone again and took a picture of the transfer confirmation, then another of the emails. My hands were steady now, more steady than they had been at the brunch table. As I slipped the folder back into place and walked out of the office, one thing became unmistakably clear. Melissa had not just pushed me to the edge of the family. She had rewritten the record to make it look like I had never been there at all. And as I closed the front door behind me and stepped back into the quiet street, a new thought settled in with absolute clarity. If she had gone this far to erase me on paper, what exactly was she preparing to do next? By the time I got back home, the quiet in my house felt different than it had the day before. It was no longer the kind of quiet that wrapped around you like comfort. It felt like space, space to think, space to see things clearly. I set my purse down, placed the printed copies I had taken onto my dining table, and stood there for a moment, looking at them as if they might rearrange themselves into a different story. They did not. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone careful, measured in a way that immediately told me this was not a casual call. Danielle." There was a brief pause. "Melissa mentioned you stopped by the house this morning." I did not sit down. I stayed standing, one hand resting on the back of a chair. "I did," I said. "I used the key you gave me." Another pause, slightly longer this time. "Mom," he began, exhaling softly, "we really need to talk about boundaries." The word landed differently than anything he had said before. Boundaries. I glanced down at the documents on the table, then back toward the window. "That sounds important," I replied. "What kind of boundaries?" "We just think it would be better if you did not come by unannounced anymore," he said, "especially when no one is home." His tone was calm, but there was something underneath it, something firm, something that felt rehearsed. "I see," I said. "And when were you planning to tell me that?" He hesitated. "We were going to bring it up soon." I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. "Of course you were." He shifted slightly on the other end. I could hear a door closing in the background, then Melissa's voice faintly, too distant to make out the words, but close enough to confirm she was there, listening. "Mom, it is not a big deal," Daniel continued. "We are just trying to keep things structured." That word again. Structured, defined, controlled. I walked over to the table and picked up one of the printed emails, holding it lightly between my fingers. Daniel, I said, my voice steady. Can I ask you something directly? Sure. Who paid for your house? There was silence. Not confusion. Not surprise. Silence. Then, we have talked about this before, he said carefully. Melissa and I handled the purchase together. I closed my eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. Is that what you believe? I asked. His response came a little quicker this time. That is what happened. I nodded, even though he could not see me. All right, I said quietly. That is very helpful. The conversation ended shortly after that, politely, almost gently, as if we were discussing something ordinary. But when I set my phone down, I noticed something had shifted in a way I could not ignore. This was no longer about being excluded from dinners or group messages. This was about something more deliberate, something being actively maintained. I walked to the front window and looked out on my street, the same houses, the same sidewalks I had known for decades. Then I turned back toward the table, toward the documents, and this time I did not hesitate. I gathered them into a folder, straightened the edges, and set them aside with intention. If they were going to redefine the truth, then I would need more than memory to respond. I would need clarity, evidence, structure of my own. And as I reached for my purse again, already thinking about where I needed to go next, one realization settled in with quiet certainty. If Daniel was willing to repeat her version of the story without hesitation, then this was no longer just Melissa's plan. It was something they were both protecting, and that meant whatever came next would not be small. I did not drive to the bank right away. Instead, I went somewhere else first. There's a small office park about 10 minutes from my house, the kind with beige buildings and neatly trimmed hedges, where my late husband's attorney used to work. The sign out front still had the same name, Reynolds and Carter, attorneys at law, and seeing it stirred something steady inside me. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, looking at the front door. I had not needed legal advice in years, not since my husband passed. Back then, everything had been simple, clear, or at least I thought it had been. I picked up my folder, stepped out of the car, and walked inside. The receptionist looked up and smiled politely. Good afternoon. How can I help you? I would like to speak with Mr. Reynolds, if he is available, I said. Evelyn Carter. She typed something into her computer, then nodded. He is in. Give me just a moment. A few minutes later, I was sitting across from Martin Reynolds in his office, the same dark wood desk, the same framed certificates on the wall. He looked older, of course. We both did, but his eyes were just as sharp as I remembered. Evelyn, he said warmly, standing to shake my hand. It has been a long time. It has, I replied, taking my seat. I wish I were here under simpler circumstances. He studied my expression for a second before sitting back down. Tell me what is going on. I did not rush. I placed a folder on his desk, opened it, and turned it toward him. I need to understand something very clearly, I said. And I need to know what has been recorded, not just what has been said. He nodded and began flipping through the documents. The transfer confirmations, the printed emails, the dates, the amounts. He took his time, which I appreciated. Finally, he leaned back slightly and folded his hands. These are concerning, he said. Very concerning. In what way? I asked. In the way that suggests someone has been reorganizing the narrative, he replied carefully. I let that sit for a moment. Can financial contributions be reassigned like this? I asked. On paper, he shook his head. Not without a trail. And if there's a trail, it can be followed. That was the first time since the brunch that I felt something shift in a measurable way. Not just emotionally, structurally. And what about estate records? I continued. If someone wanted to position themselves as the primary contributor to a household, would that affect anything long-term? He leaned forward slightly now, more focused. It could, he said, depending on how assets are structured, how wills are written, how ownership is documented. Why do you ask? I held his gaze. Because I'm starting to believe that I have been written out of more than just conversations. The room was quiet for a second. Then he nodded slowly. All right, he said. Then we need to look at everything. Not just these documents. Bank records. Property filings. Your existing estate plan. He paused, then added, and we should do it quickly. I felt a calm settle over me, not the kind that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from direction. There's one more thing, I said. My son believes a version of events that does not match these records. Martin's expression did not change. That happens more often than you would think, he said. But belief does not outweigh documentation. I nodded once. That was exactly what I needed to hear. When I left the office, the air outside felt cooler than it had earlier, or maybe I just noticed it more. I got back into my car, placed a folder carefully on the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment. Then I reached into my purse and took out my phone. I opened my contacts and scrolled until I found Lily's name. My thumb hovered over the screen for just a second before I pressed call. If there were conversations happening that I had never been part of, then it was time I heard them from someone who had. And as the phone began to ring, one thought stayed clear in my mind. I was no longer trying to understand what they had done. I was preparing to prove it. The phone rang twice before Lily picked up, her voice softer than usual. "Grandma," she said, almost like she already knew this call mattered. "Hi, sweetheart," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "Are you somewhere you can talk for a minute?" There was a brief, rustling sound, like she was moving from one place to another. "Yeah, I am in my room. What is going on?" I sat back in my car, the folder still resting on the passenger seat beside me. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," I said. "Have there been conversations about me that I was not part of?" There was a pause. Not confusion, not surprise. A pause that told me she was deciding how much to say. "Grandma, yes," she admitted quietly. I closed my eyes for just a second, letting that land fully before continuing. "Can you tell me what kind of conversations?" Another pause, longer this time. Then she spoke again, a little faster, like she had already crossed a line and might as well finish. "Mom says you make things complicated," she said. "She says it is easier if decisions stay within the core family." That is what she calls it. Core family. Hearing it out loud, spoken by someone who had no reason to shape the words, made it settle in a different way. "And who is in that group?" I asked. "Just Mom, Dad, me, and Ethan," she replied. "Sometimes Nana and Grandpa, Melissa's parents." "Of course." I nodded slowly, even though she could not see me. "Has your dad ever said anything different?" I asked. Lily hesitated. "Not really," she said. "He usually just agrees with Mom, or he says things like, 'That is just how we are doing it now.'" I let out a slow breath, then shifted slightly in my seat. "Lily, I need to ask you one more thing," I said, "and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "Okay. Have you ever seen anything about money? Conversations, messages, anything like that?" There was a faint sound, like she was adjusting her phone. "I mean, kind of," she said. "One time I saw Mom's laptop open in the kitchen, and there was an email. She was writing to someone about the house." My grip on the phone tightened just slightly. "What did it say?" "I do not remember all of it," Lily said, "but I remember she wrote something like, 'It is important that everything reflects our contribution moving forward.'" I sat very still. That sentence connected too cleanly with everything I had already seen. Too cleanly to ignore. "Did she mention me?" I asked. "Yeah," Lily said quietly. "She said something about how it would be confusing if people thought you were involved financially." The air in the car felt different again. Not heavier, clearer. "Thank you for telling me," I said gently. "I know that was not easy." "Grandma," she added quickly, her voice a little more urgent now. "Please do not tell Mom I said anything." "I will not," I assured her. "You have my word." We spoke for another minute about small things, school, her upcoming recital, but the conversation had already shifted everything that mattered. When I ended the call, I did not move right away. I looked down at the folder beside me, then back at my phone. There was no longer any question about what had been happening. This was not passive exclusion. This was active revision. Planned, maintained, reinforced. And for the first time since that brunch, I understood something with complete certainty. Melissa was not just controlling how the family functioned. She was controlling how the family would be remembered. I reached into my purse again, this time pulling out a small notebook I had not used in years. I opened it, wrote down the exact sentence Lily had told me, and underlined it once. Then I closed the notebook and set it beside the folder. If this was about shaping a narrative, than I would need. More than documents. I would need timing, precision, in a setting where the truth could not be redirected or softened. I started the car, my mind already moving ahead, because now the question was no longer whether I would confront them. The question was how to do it in a way that they could not walk away from. That evening, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the houses across the street, my phone buzzed again. This time it was not a call. It was a message. A group message. I stared at the notification for a second before opening it. Family dinner, Sunday at 6 p.m. Our place, Melissa had written. No greeting. No explanation. Just a statement. Below it, Daniel had added, hope everyone can make it. I noticed something immediately. This was not the same thread I usually saw. The names at the top included Daniel, Melissa, Lily, Ethan, and Melissa's parents. My number had been added at the very end, as if it had been inserted into something already in motion. I scrolled up. The earlier messages were still there. Conversations about meal planning, seating arrangements, even a short exchange about what wine to serve. None of it had included me before that moment. I read through the thread slowly, taking in each detail. Melissa had suggested a formal dinner. Daniel had agreed. Her parents had offered to bring dessert. It was organized, efficient, and already decided. My addition to the conversation came after everything had been settled. I typed a simple response. I will be there. Then I set the phone down. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. A private message from Melissa this time. Evelyn, I think it would be best if we keep Sunday focused and respectful. No need to revisit earlier misunderstandings. I read that line carefully. Focused, respectful, misunderstandings. Each word chosen with care. Each one designed to frame the situation before it even began. I picked up the phone and called her instead of replying. She answered on the third ring. Hello, Evelyn, she said, her tone polite, controlled. Melissa, I replied. I got your message. Good, she said. I just want Sunday to go smoothly for everyone. I walked slowly toward my living room window as we spoke, looking out at the quiet street. I want that too, I said. Clarity usually helps with that. There was a brief pause. Clarity can also create unnecessary tension, she replied. Sometimes it is better to move forward. I let that sit for a moment. That depends on what you're moving forward from, I said. Another pause, slightly longer this time. Then she spoke again, her voice still calm, but a shade firmer. Evelyn, we have built a structure that works for our family. I would appreciate it if you respected that. There was again. Structure. Always structure. I understand, I said. And I think Sunday will be a good opportunity to understand it even better. She did not respond right away. When she did, her tone had shifted just slightly. All right, she said. We will see you at 6. The call ended there. I stood by the window for a few seconds longer, then turned back toward the dining table where my folder and notebook were still waiting. I walked over, opened the folder, and reviewed the documents again. The transfer confirmations, the emails, the dates. Then I opened my notebook and read the sentence Lily had repeated to me. It is important that everything reflects our contribution moving forward. I underlined it again, this time more firmly. Sunday was no longer just a dinner. It was a setting, a controlled environment that Melissa believed she had already defined. The seating, the tone, the expectations. She thought she knew exactly how it would unfold. And that gave me something I had not had before. Predictability. I closed the notebook and placed it neatly on top of the folder. Then I walked into the kitchen and opened one of my drawers, pulling out a clean set of envelopes. I selected a few documents, slid them carefully inside, and sealed them one by one. Not everything, just enough. As I set the envelopes down on the counter, I felt that same steady clarity settle in again. Melissa believed Sunday would reinforce her version of the family. Daniel was already aligned with her, and everyone else would be sitting at that table, expecting another carefully managed evening. I looked at the clock on the wall, then back at the envelopes. They were not expecting anything else, and that was exactly why Sunday would change everything. Sunday came with the kind of stillness that usually means something is about to shift. I woke up earlier than I needed to, and moved through my morning with quiet precision. Coffee first, then a light breakfast, then I laid everything out on the dining table one more time. The envelopes sat exactly where I had left them the night before, clean, sealed, and deliberate. I opened one just to check. Inside were copies of the transfer confirmations and one of Melissa's emails. Not all of them, just enough to introduce the truth without overwhelming the moment. I closed it again and slid it back into place. At around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed with another message in the group thread. Melissa had sent a short update. Dinner will be served promptly at 6 p.m. Please arrive on time. Below it, her mother added, looking forward to a lovely evening. I read the message without responding. The tone was exactly what I expected. Controlled, confident, already decided. They were preparing for a performance, not a conversation. That mattered, because it meant they would follow a script, and scripts can be interrupted. Around noon, I made a small but important decision. I drove back to the attorney's office. Martin was not surprised to see me. I had a feeling you might come back before the week was over, he said as I stepped inside. I placed one of the envelopes on his desk and slid it toward him. I'm going to a family dinner tonight, I said, and I want to make sure I handle it the right way. He opened the envelope, reviewed the documents quickly, then looked up at me. What is your goal? He asked. It was a simple question, but it required a precise answer. Clarity, I said, in front of everyone. He nodded slowly. Then do not rush it, he advised. Let them speak first. Let them define the situation in their own words. Once they do that, your documents will not just contradict them. They will expose the structure behind it. I considered that for a moment. It aligned exactly with what I'd been thinking, but hearing it said out loud gave it weight. And legally? I asked, am I safe to present copies like these? Yes, he said. They're your records. Just keep the conversation focused on facts. No accusations you cannot support. Let the evidence carry the message. I nodded once, then gathered the envelope and stood up. Thank you, I said. I will let you know how it goes. I think I already know, he replied, a faint hint of a smile crossing his face. Just remember, you are not walking into their structure. You are bringing your own. By the time I got back home, the afternoon had settled into that quiet stretch before evening. I changed into a simple navy dress, the kind I used to wear to church, and placed the envelopes neatly into my purse. Not all of them, just 3, enough to open the door. At 5:30, I locked my front door and headed out. The drive felt shorter this time. When I pulled into Daniel and Melissa's driveway, I noticed something new. 2 additional cars were parked along the curb. Guests, of course. I stepped out of my car, smoothed my dress, and picked up my purse. As I walked toward the front door, I could already hear voices inside. Laughter, glasses clinking, the sound of a gathering already in motion. Melissa had not just planned a dinner. She had expanded the audience. I rang the doorbell. A moment later, the door opened, and there she stood, smiling as if everything was exactly as it should be. Evelyn, she said warmly. Right on time. I stepped inside, taking in the room. The table was fully set. More chairs than usual. More people than I expected. Daniel stood near the center, greeting someone I did not recognize. He glanced up briefly when I entered, then returned to his conversation. I moved further into the room, my eyes scanning the space, noting the arrangement, the positions, the flow. This was not just a dinner. This was a stage, and they believed they were in control of it. I adjusted my grip on my purse, feeling the edges of the envelopes inside. I was not here to stop their performance. I was here to let it unfold, just long enough for everyone to see exactly what it was. Melissa moved through the room with quiet precision, greeting guests, adjusting place settings, making sure every detail aligned with whatever image she had already constructed in her mind. I watched her for a moment before stepping further inside, offering polite nods to people I recognized and brief smiles to those I did not. Evelyn, you remember the Harrisons, Melissa said, guiding a couple toward me before I had the chance to settle. They live just down the street. The woman smiled warmly. We have heard so much about you, she said. I held her gaze for a second, then returned the smile. I hope it was accurate, I replied. Melissa's hand rested lightly on the back of a chair as she added, We like to keep our circle close, so it is always nice to introduce extended connections when it feels appropriate. Extended connections. The phrasing was subtle, but not accidental. I acknowledged it with a small nod, then moved toward the table. Each place setting was carefully arranged. White plates, folded linen napkins, name cards written in the same neat handwriting I had seen on the calendar. I found mine quickly. It was not at the end this time. It was placed halfway down the table, across from Melissa's father. That was new. I took my seat without comment, setting my purse gently on the chair beside me. As guests settled in, Daniel moved to the head of the table, lifting his glass slightly to get everyone's attention. "Thanks for coming, everyone," he said, his voice confident, practiced. "We wanted tonight to be about bringing people together and appreciating the way our family has grown." I listened carefully, not the words themselves, but how they were structured. "Melissa and I have worked hard to build something stable, something that reflects who we are and what we value," he continued. Melissa sat beside him, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. "And we are grateful for everyone who has contributed to that." Contributed. Another carefully chosen word. I reached for my water glass, taking a small sip as I let him finish. "We have learned that clarity matters," he added. "Knowing where everyone stands helps avoid confusion." There was again clarity, structure, definition, the same framework, repeated now in front of an audience. I set my glass down slowly, my fingers resting lightly against the stem. Across the table, Melissa's mother nodded approvingly, while her father leaned back slightly, observing. The Harrisons exchanged polite smiles. Everyone was following the tone that had been set. Dinner began shortly after. Plates were passed, conversation flowed, and for a while, everything moved exactly as Melissa had intended. Safe topics, controlled exchanges. At one point, Melissa turned to me directly. "Evelyn, how have you been?" she asked, her tone pleasant, inviting but measured. I met her gaze. "I have been learning a great deal this week," I said. She tilted her head slightly. "About?" I let a brief pause settle before answering. "About how things are defined," I replied. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, just enough to notice. Melissa smiled, but did not deepen. "Well," she said lightly, "that is always an evolving process." I nodded once, then reached down beside me and adjusted my purse, making sure it was positioned exactly where I wanted it. The weight of the envelopes inside felt steady, reassuring. I did not reach for them yet. Not yet. The timing mattered. As the main course was cleared and dessert began to be prepared in the kitchen, Daniel leaned back slightly and glanced around the table. "I think it is important that we all feel comfortable moving forward," he said, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention again. "We have built something that works, and I would like to keep it that way." I looked at him then, really looked at him, taking in the certainty in his expression, the alignment in his posture with Melissa's, the quiet agreement already settled across the table. They believed this was already decided, that the structure they had described would hold because no one would challenge it. I folded my hands lightly in front of me, then let them rest there for a moment before speaking. "Daniel," I said calmly, my voice clear enough to shift the room without raising it. "Before we talk about moving forward, I think we should take a moment to make sure we all understand what we are moving from." The table went quiet, not abruptly, but noticeably. Conversations paused. Glasses were set down. Melissa's eyes met mine, steady, controlled, but sharper now. "What do you mean?" she asked. I held her gaze for just a second longer, then reached slowly for my purse. I said, my hand resting on the clasp, that I brought something tonight that might help clarify things for everyone. And as I opened it, I could feel the entire room shift, just slightly, in a way that told me this was the moment they had not prepared for. I did not rush the moment. I opened my purse slowly, deliberately, and took out the first envelope, placing it on the table in front of me. The sound of the paper against the linen tablecloth was quiet, but it carried. Every eye at that table was already on me. Melissa leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression composed, though I could see the calculation behind her eyes. Daniel's hand hovered near his glass, but he did not pick it up. "Evelyn," Melissa said, her voice calm but edged now. "This really is not the time." I raised my hand gently, not to interrupt, but to set a boundary. "Actually," I said, my tone steady, "this is exactly the time." I opened the envelope and slid out the first document, turning it so the table could see. 3 years ago, I wrote a check for $25,000 to help with the down payment on this house. I looked directly at Daniel. Do you remember that? He shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening slightly. Mom, we talked about this, yes, I said, cutting in just enough to keep control of the moment. We did, and that is why I brought this. I tapped the paper lightly. This is the transfer confirmation tied to that exact amount. I let the silence stretch for a second before continuing. What is interesting is that this document does not list my account as the source. It lists Melissa's. A few people at the table leaned forward slightly. The Harrisons exchanged a quick glance. Melissa's father straightened in his chair. That must be a misunderstanding, Melissa said smoothly. Financial records can be formatted in different ways, depending on how accounts are structured. I nodded once, as if acknowledging the possibility. Then I reached into my purse again and pulled out the second document. That would be a reasonable explanation, I said, placing it beside the first, if it were not for this. I turned it so the text faced outward. This is an email you sent, I said, looking directly at Melissa now. You wrote, "It is important that everything reflects our contribution moving forward." Her expression did not change immediately, but the stillness in her posture deepened, just slightly. I continued before she could respond. And here, I added, pulling out the third sheet, is another message where you state, "We have been handling everything on our own." I let that sit for a moment, then looked around the table. I would like to understand how both of those statements can be accurate at the same time. The room was completely quiet now. Even the kitchen sounds had faded. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice lower than before. Mom, this is not how we handle things in front of guests. I turned to him calmly. Then perhaps it should not have been introduced in front of them, I replied, letting the weight of his earlier speech settle back onto him. Melissa leaned forward slightly, her hands folding neatly on the table. Evelyn, she said, her tone controlled but firmer now, you are taking internal family matters and presenting them out of context. Then please, I said evenly, gesturing lightly toward the documents, give us the context. She held my gaze for a second longer than before. Then she looked briefly at Daniel. It was a small glance, but it was enough. For the first time that evening, she did not immediately fill the silence. Daniel shifted again, then spoke. The finances were consolidated, he said carefully. It made things simpler. I tilted my head slightly. Simpler for whom? I asked. He did not answer right away. Across the table, Melissa's mother set her fork down slowly. Her father leaned forward, studying the documents more closely. The Harrisons were no longer smiling. The tone of the room had changed in a way that could not be reversed. I gathered the edges of the papers lightly with my fingers, not removing them, just aligning them. I'm not here to argue, I said. I am here to understand how my contributions were reassigned, how my involvement was minimized, and how that version of events became the one everyone is expected to accept. I looked directly at Melissa again, because from where I am sitting, this is not about structure. It is about control. The word landed cleanly. For the first time, Melissa's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to register. She leaned back slightly, her posture adjusting as if recalibrating. And in that moment, I knew something had changed. Not just in what had been said, but in what could no longer be denied. I rested my hands calmly on the table and let the silence hold. Because now, the next move was not mine. It was theirs. And whatever they chose to say next would decide whether this was still a conversation or something much harder to walk away from. The silence did not hold for long. It broke sharply, unevenly, like something under pressure finally giving way. Wait a second, Melissa's father said, his voice cutting through the room with a firmness I had not heard from him before. He reached forward and pulled one of the documents closer, adjusting his glasses as he read. Are you saying this money did not come from Melissa? He asked, looking directly at her now. Melissa sat very still, her hands still folded, but the composure she had been holding began to crack at the edges. That is not what this is about, she replied quickly. It is more complicated than that. Complicated? He repeated, his tone rising. It says right here, $25,000. That is not complicated. That is a number. Across the table, her mother set her napkin down abruptly. Melissa, is this true? She demanded. Daniel shifted beside her, his voice tense now. Everyone needs to calm down, he said, but it came out thinner than he intended. There is context here. I felt my chest tighten, not from confusion anymore, but from the sheer weight of everything finally surfacing at once. Then give it, I said, my voice no longer as steady as before. Give the context. Melissa turned to me sharply. Evelyn, you are twisting this into something it is not, she said, her tone losing its smooth edge. No, I replied, leaning forward slightly now, my hands pressing against the table. I am asking you to explain how my money became your contribution. The words landed harder than I expected, even to my own ears. Daniel stood up halfway from his chair, then sat back down again, running a hand through his hair. We consolidated accounts, he said again, more forcefully this time, as if repeating it could make it hold. It made everything easier to manage. Easier for who? I shot back, my voice rising despite myself. Because it certainly made it easier to erase me. The room shifted again. Not just uncomfortable now. Fractured. Lily was staring at the table, her face pale. Ethan looked confused, glancing between his parents. Melissa's father pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the floor. You told us you handled that down payment yourselves, he said, his voice low but sharp. That is what you said. Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she did not have an immediate answer. Her mother shook her head, disbelief written across her face. Melissa, she said, her voice trembling now. Did you let us believe that? Daniel looked between them, his expression tightening. It was not meant to be deceptive, he said quickly. We just organized things differently. That is not organizing, her father snapped. That is misrepresenting. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I felt something inside me break loose then, not quiet, not controlled. Do you have any idea what it feels like, I said, my voice shaking now, to sit at that table and be told I was never part of this family, while you were rewriting the truth behind my back? My hands trembled slightly against the table, but I did not pull them away. I trusted you, I added, looking directly at Daniel. I trusted both of you. Daniel's face shifted, something like guilt flickering through it, but it did not settle. Melissa straightened in her chair, her voice sharper now, defensive. We built this life, she said. We made decisions that worked for us. You cannot just walk in and demand recognition for everything. I stared at her, the anger rising fully now. Recognition, I repeated. This is not about recognition. This is about truth. The word echoed in the room, louder than I intended, but I did not take it back. No one spoke for a moment, not even the guests. The structure Melissa had built was no longer holding. It was collapsing in real time, piece by piece, under the weight of what could no longer be denied. I took a slow breath, steadying myself just enough to continue. This does not end here, I said, my voice lower now, but no less firm. Because if you were willing to change the story about money, then I need to know what else you have already changed. And as I looked around that table, at the faces that were no longer certain, one realization settled in with undeniable force. This was not just a family argument anymore. This was something that was about to reach far beyond this room. The room did not recover. It could not. Whatever version of control Melissa had built collapsed completely in the span of a few minutes. And this time, no one was willing to help her rebuild. Her father stood up fully now, pushing his chair back with a force that echoed against the hardwood floor. I need you to answer me clearly, he said, pointing directly at her. Did you take money that was not yours and present it as your own contribution? Melissa's composure broke. Not gradually, completely. I did not take anything, she snapped, her voice rising for the first time. It was all handled through our accounts. Everything was shared. That is not what the documents show. He shot back immediately. And it is not what you told us. Her mother shook her head, stepping back slightly as if putting distance between herself and the situation. We vouched for you, she said, her voice unsteady. We told people you and Daniel built everything yourselves. Daniel stood abruptly this time, his chair scraping loudly behind him. Enough, he said, but there was no authority left in his voice. Only strain. We are not doing this here. I stood as well, not to match him, but because I refused to remain seated while my reality was being negotiated. It is already being done here, I said, my voice firm, no longer shaking. You made sure of that the moment you decided to rewrite what I gave you. The Harrisons were no longer pretending to be neutral. The woman looked directly at Melissa and said quietly, "We were told a very different story." That sentence landed harder than anything else in the room, because it confirmed what this had always been. Not just a private manipulation, a public one. Melissa looked around the table, her eyes moving from one face to another, searching for support. She found none. Lily sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap. Ethan looked overwhelmed, his gaze fixed on the table. Daniel's shoulders had dropped slightly, the certainty gone from his posture. And then her father spoke again, slower this time, each word deliberate. "If this is how you handle something as serious as financial truth," he said, "then I do not know what else you have misrepresented." That was the moment everything shifted beyond repair. Melissa's expression hardened, not into control, but into something defensive and cornered. "You are all overreacting," she said. "This is being blown out of proportion." "Out of proportion," her father repeated, his voice rising again. "You built your credibility on something that was not yours. That is not proportion. That is deception." Daniel stepped forward then, his voice lower, almost pleading now. "We can fix this," he said. "We just need to talk it through privately." I looked at him for a long moment, really seeing him in a way I had not allowed myself to before. Not as my son, not as someone I had trusted, but as someone who had chosen a version of truth that excluded me because it was easier to live with. "No," I said quietly, but clearly enough that everyone heard it. "There is nothing to fix." I reached into my purse one last time and took out a final envelope, placing it on the table. "This is a formal notice from my attorney," I said. "Effective immediately, any financial support, past or future, is being legally documented and protected. There will be no further ambiguity about where anything came from." Daniel stared at the envelope, his face draining of color. "Mom," he began, but the word held no weight anymore. "You wanted clarity," I said. "Now you have it." I picked up my purse, leaving the documents where they were, and stepped back from the table. No one stopped me. No one tried, because there was nothing left to negotiate. As I walked toward the door, I heard Melissa's father say something under his breath, low and final. "This is not over." He was right, but not in the way he thought. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, closing the door behind me with a quiet, definitive click. For the first time in years, I was no longer trying to hold a place in a family that had already decided to remove me. I had taken back the truth, the record, and every piece of power they had tried to quietly rewrite. And inside that house, the version of themselves they had built was already beginning to fall apart without me.